We at one point in time had in state law an obligation that before you go to the Public Service Commission and propose a new commercial nuclear plant in order to meet your native load, that you have a waste management strategy. We removed that and removed that in order to begin the conversation. And I don't think that either Senator Carroll or I or anybody who voted for it thought that that was the be-all and end-all, but it is somewhat frustrating that we are contemplating as a nation the expansion of nuclear capacity when we have yet to develop a waste management strategy. I'm unaware of any other industry, and even though they have fought tooth and nail to not do it responsibly, any other utility sector that doesn't have a waste management strategy. Whether that be a coal or that be a decommissioning of solar, wind, or other capacity. So the question remains, do we have the maturity and the willingness and the desire to safely manage waste for a millennium? I've just put a couple of points up there. The Iran nuclear deal, we had assumed, and all of the writing, including Professor Weinberg, had assumed that we would have a stronger International Atomic Energy Agency to address the international issues regarding, and we'd have stronger cooperation on the management of spent nuclear material and strategies for long-term management and disposal. And we've seen how unfortunately tenuous that can be. Depending on the shifting in the political winds within nations. We have the Ukraine war and the targeting of some of the nuclear facilities that occurred. The last two are just, I raised just so we be aware of the fact that when Professor Weinberg was talking about the maturity and the institutional capacity to manage waste, we're talking about the long term. Right, Love Canal was a dry canal that was constructed up near Niagara Falls many years ago by Hooker, and Hooker Chemical bought it and used it to dispose of drums of hazardous waste. Unfortunately, the historical and the knowledge of the fact that that waste was buried there was lost over the course of 30 or 40 years, and those wastes were intercepted and were allowed to release as part of the construction of a school for the community of Love Canal, resulting in one of the earliest poster children for the Superfund program, which was an entire community whose water supply and much land was contaminated. Edith Avenue is a little closer to home. The Old Smoky, the incinerator that Louisville used to use to get rid of its garbage, buried most of its waste, which was a lot of lead and other heavy metals and non-combustible materials, were buried over at Edith Avenue in an elevated landfill right next to the Ohio River along River Road. There's now soccer fields on it, including the women's professional soccer team has their offices there on a building that floats rather than has concrete foundations, because there is about an 18-inch cap on top of the landfill, which was breached up to the point where it almost released the ash, because when the landfill closed, it was transferred from solid waste management, who would not let anything go into the ground, over to parks, and somebody decided it was okay to park RVs on top of the landfill during the Dumber Than Whatever festival, that or Louder Than Life festival that occurred. So it rained for several days, and they brought a front-end loader in to drag the RVs off the landfill, digging into the cap of what should be a hazardous waste landfill in order to drag the vehicles. So the idea that we are going to have the maturity to remember where we put this stuff and not mess with it for thousands upon thousands of years is a legitimate issue, I think. In fact, there is I'm sorry, let me go past that. There is a whole field called semiotics, where you have linguists and engineers getting together to decide what markers you're going to place on the permanent repository so that people don't think they found their generation's version of Tut's tomb and go opening it up and messing with it. On the left, you have a tsunami stone. This is what's used to encourage people not to build below that elevation because of past experience with tsunamis. On the middle and the right, you have the artist's rendition of the sort of signage and the sort of physical construction that you would do for a permanent repository to try to tell folks sometime in the future what you have buried there. The reason it becomes important is this is the difference between Old English at the top there and what it means in modern English. And this is since 1066. The wastes we're talking about managing are going to be there for a considerably longer time and remain hazardous for a considerably longer time. So getting back to the earlier issue, this is, I think, the conundrum, right? It's the waste conundrum that back in 1991, when we were negotiating Kentucky's solid waste law, we had representatives of the waste industry, we had government, we had citizens, and I was their chief negotiator. And somebody from the waste industry said, you know, the conundrum is everybody wants their waste picked up and nobody wants it put down. And that is the conundrum we find ourselves in spades when you're dealing with nuclear waste. The strategies: one below ground permanent repository requiring minimal surveillance. That was the Yucca Mountain model, and that has been put on hold, and the plug has been pulled for the time being. Second is several above ground independent spent fuel storage installations or consolidated interim storage facilities that require a heightened level of surveillance. There you get into the management, who is going to manage, who is going to pay for it, where you're going to site them, and what sort of provisions you have regarding your host communities. And the third is the indefinite storage at or near the generating plants that is occurring largely currently. One of the big issues is who pays for it, right? And this is a generational equity issue. It's not a technical issue, but we have, within the space of about 70 years now, which is almost the space of my lifetime, we have done a really, really good job of fouling the nest. And we are passing to the next generation a legacy of hazardous waste sites, of coal ash landfills and coal ash ponds that are leaking and contaminating groundwater, landfills that will leak and contaminate groundwater long after the landfills are closed and long before the biologic activity ever reaches stability. And this is kind of the crown jewel of the legacy issues, where we are talking about going back to Weinberg's Faustian bargain. We are talking about passing to a future generation the waste management responsibilities for the energy that we consume today. So I think, you know, I'm reminded of a pogo, which Walt Kelly's cartoon, where a pogo is walking along and he says nuclear. He says, it ain't so new and it ain't so clear. But I think that from my curmudgeonly point of view, as a policy matter, when you're looking at what is now driving, because, you know, nuclear has during its first era, over the past 70 years, has failed it has had what Amory Lovins calls a terminal case of market forces. It has failed to meet the test of being competitive when you look at the levelized cost of energy, despite massive subsidies that have been provided for liability and also for licensing and siting. So the conversation has shifted to a certain extent. We have new demand from data centers, or we have new demand from crypto operations. And that is largely what is driving what is now being looked at as new demand, regardless of how speculative that is. Or we are talking about climate issues, right? In both of those categories, when you check the boxes of being able to be deployed soon rather than later, being able to meet the demand in a way that is resilient and that doesn't create a new legacy of long-term problems, I think solar is going to outperform given a clear-headed side-by-side analysis. And that's, that I think is where I come down, is that there are easier ways to boil water than to split atoms at this point in time. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tom.